Hello, learners, and welcome to the third lecture in this NPTEL course titled 20th Century Poetry. I ended the previous lecture with an indication that I would be discussing William Butler Yeats's poem Lake Isle of Innisfree in the next lecture. That discussion, however, will be deferred by one lecture since I feel that I need to wrap up some strands in the discussion of transatlantic modernism. And especially, I need to explain exactly how the newness and the innovation that we today associate with modernism was derived both from its transatlantic connection as well as a very careful use of previous traditional forms of writing and thinking. That is to say, I will be focusing in this lecture on how two transatlantic writers, that is to say, poets who moved from America to England and inaugurated modernism, how these two poets made a very careful and very different kind of use of tradition. After this lecture, I will return, as promised, to a discussion of William Butler Yeats's Lake Isle of Innisfree. So that discussion, as I mentioned, will be deferred by one lecture. Now, as I indicated briefly in my first lecture, there are some difficulties and some challenges in situating the chronology of modernism. And some of that challenge comes from the structural problem of all literary history, which is to say, writing does not occur and reading does not occur with a label. We do not read with the self-consciousness that we are reading work or literature written in the 21st century, for instance, nor do writers write with a formal awareness that they are writing in a particular historical period. That is true of all literary periods, and the labels of chronology or history are provided later on. So all historical categories are retrospective formulation. This is something that was first articulated by the scholar Stan Smith in the context of literary modernism, but it is a fact that holds true for all literary history and all periods of literary history. That said, modernism is a little bit different from other literary historical periods because this was a period that had some self-consciousness that the writers who were producing works of modernism and readers who were consuming and engaging with those works were living in a distinctly modern period. That self-consciousness of writing in a modern period or reading in a modern style itself has a history, and that history is a little bit older than modernism itself. So we will discuss a little bit about that and try and see how the writing that we call modernism today inaugurates both a self-consciousness of modernism itself. So today it is possible for us all to feel self-conscious that we are reading in a new way. And that feeling of self-consciousness, as it attaches itself to the production and consumption of literature, itself can be seen to be inaugurated in this modernist era. So let us think a little bit about that. In the year 1911, Alan Upward, the scholar, wrote in The New Age that it is a sign of the times that so many of us should be busy in studying the signs of the times. And this formulation itself, a preoccupation with the signs of the times, and the observation that the defining feature of our time is that we are thinking about our time. So the defining feature of our time is that we are self-conscious. This idea is articulated in this context by Alan Upward in the year 1911. The year 1911 is an appropriate time because it falls very much in line with most scholarly accounts of modernism. However, if one looks carefully at the phrase sign of the times, one can remember that this phrase itself is not new, and that in writing this, Alan Upward is echoing Thomas Carlyle, the Victorian critic, scholar, and writer, who in the year 1829 wrote an essay, Signs of the Times, and pretty much said similar things, which is that what defines our time, that is, what defined Carlyle's time, that is, what defined, according to Carlyle, the Victorian period, was a tendency to worry about what was new in their time. And this is exactly what Alan Upward is saying in The New Age in the year 1911. So this is one sense in which the Victorian period anticipated many of the concerns that are today seen as defining modernism. Notwithstanding this anticipation, several modernist writers and poets argued that modernism was about breaking with the past. A very famous quote from Ezra Pound, who I introduced in the first lecture, goes like this. Pound asks poets to, quote, break the iamb. Iamb, of course, refers to the iambic meter. It is a pattern of unstressed and stressed syllables. And Pound's great innovation and great suggestion for poets was to write in free verse, that is, to not follow any traditional stress pattern, and to write in a way that would articulate the thoughts, the feelings, the image, the observations of the poet as accurately. So this free verse itself was seen as a radical break from traditional modes of writing poetry. While break the iamb certainly characterizes modernism as being desirous of breaking with the past, there's another quote by William Carlos Williams which suggests that modernism was not so much about new, but more about the old. And this is in the context of T.S. Eliot's very famous poem, The Wasteland. While reviewing this poem, William Carlos Williams, an American poet who, unlike Eliot or Pound, stayed in America and did not migrate to the UK, William Carlos Williams wrote about The Wasteland that it was a catastrophe to our letters, our meaning American letters, and further that in writing this poem, T.S. Eliot had given poetry back to the academics, unquote. So, given poetry back to the academics means that there was a movement to retrieve poetry, to take it away from the academics, which in Williams's view was a good thing. However, with the success of T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, that trend, that movement was abruptly stopped and reversed. Therefore, T.S. Eliot's poem The Wasteland, in William Carlos Williams's view, does not represent innovation or a radical break with the past, but instead represents a retrograde movement, a movement back in time, not innovation, but something very conservative, something that interrupts and reverses movements of innovation. So there are contradictions. That is the point. It is never simple or easy to decide that modernism is about revolutionizing poetry. There are voices in modernism which see poetry both as breaking with the past as well as returning to the past. And it is this very fine relationship, very fine interaction with different ways of using the past that defines modernism, and that's what I will be discussing in the rest of this lecture through a focus on the work of these two American poets who migrated to London, Ezra Pound and T.S. Eliot. To further understand how Victorian literature and poetry also thought of itself as modern, but that is a sense that has not been thought through or not been given as much attention, I will quote from the scholar Isabel Armstrong. Isabel Armstrong writes that Victorian poetry also had a very strong sense of itself as modern. Thomas Carlyle, who I've just named, channeled Marx's thought on how capitalism altered relationships between people and communities, and through this alteration produced new societies. So newness was produced in society by capitalism before Ezra Pound or T.S. Eliot produced newness in poetry. So the sense that we get is that previous forms of literature also imagined themselves as new, but the difference in modernism was that dominant voices in modernist poetry conceived of modernism not just as new, but as somehow breaking away from the past. Now I will contextualize that sense. What is this breaking away from the past? The sense that these two writers had of breaking away from the past emerged from their individual experiences of being immigrants in a very new and different literary culture, that of London in the early 20th century. The quote, "make it new," is always attributed to Ezra Pound. While it is true that Ezra Pound did say "make it new," it is often misunderstood. The quote, "make it new," is misread as if Pound was advocating for a complete and absolute break with traditional forms of writing poetry. Instead, it is more useful to read "make it new" as advocating for a reconstruction, a translation, and a rebuilding of older forms of culture and literature into new forms of thinking, writing, and feeling. And one hint as to why we should think in that way comes from Ezra Pound's declaration and explanation of why he moved to London. One of the reasons Pound gave for moving to London was that he said he wanted to learn how Yeats did it. Yeats refers to, of course, William Butler Yeats, who has been a figure who seems to feature very prominently, if on the backgrounds of my discussions, and I promise I will return to discussion of Yeats's work very soon. In the words of the scholars Brooker and Perrell, Pound was too out of date at the time he arrived in London. And this phrase, "out of date," itself comes from the poem Hugh Selwyn Moberly, which Ezra Pound wrote in the year 1920 as he was leaving London for Paris. Why did Pound feel that he was out of date when he arrived in London? One reason for this may be that Pound was an American. He was a specialist in European Romance literatures, and that skill, that expertise, seemed out of place in the literary London of the early 20th century. Pound appeared as eccentric, as a bohemian, and as a latter-day troubadour, rather than a radicalizing modernist. So Ezra Pound had claimed to revolutionize poetry, but his own appearance, his own expertise, his own background was not someone who was making something new, but rather was repeating old things. And this was a struggle for Ezra Pound, and a struggle that it took about a dozen years to completely resolve and to emerge from. Early in his career, Ezra Pound did a lot of repeating old things. His 1911 work of poetry, The Canzoni, represented this very complex and erudite act of ventriloquism. The poetic persona of the Canzoni spoke through the personae of other poets, namely Dante, Bertrand de Born, Villon, Yeats, Robert Browning, Swinburne, and the Pre-Raphaelites. While this was a very erudite and painstaking act of poetic composition, this act elicited some very harsh and negative reactions. Among the famous and quite extreme reactions to this act of writing was that of Ford Madox Ford, who apparently rolled on the floor with laughter at this strategy of Ezra Pound's. Pound took this criticism in a very sporting manner, and proceeded to revise his approach, to go back to the drawing board and to revise and come up with a new way of writing and trying to engage what he saw was modern. In about a dozen years, Pound had changed gears completely and had become more authoritative and more recognized as a translator of poetry originally written in Chinese, Latin, and Italian. And as the scholars Brooker and Perel note, this kind of a transition, this kind of a journey from doing one kind of thing to another kind of thing, meant that by the time Pound left London, that is in 1920, he had gone from being out of date to being a little too up to date. So he remained out of key. That is to say, Pound remained different, a bit of a misfit, highly alienated from the literary culture of London. And that alienation, that difficulty of fitting in, was what motivated Pound's advocacy for newness, which is a very different kind of advocacy for newness that one finds in the work of T.S. Eliot. As Pound himself said, and I will quote now about T.S. Eliot, T.S. Eliot arrived in London a few years after Pound, and Pound immediately took this compatriot, younger poet, fellow American under his wing and proceeded to provide a very gentle and caring mentorship. About T.S. Eliot, Pound is supposed to have said that Eliot was the only American Pound knew of who had made what Pound could call adequate preparation for writing. This is what Pound told Harriet Monroe, who was the then editor of the Poetry magazine. And this is while he was recommending for publication in Poetry magazine the poem by T.S. Eliot, The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock. Further, Pound added that Eliot had actually trained himself and modernized himself on his own. This is a very telling comment because Pound was attracted to Eliot and recommended Eliot because he felt that Eliot had done what he himself had struggled to or failed to and finally maybe even refused to do, which is to modernize himself so that he was actually ahead of the times. We can try and understand a little bit of that, what Pound praised in Eliot, by reading a long quote from Eliot's essay published in the year 1921 titled The Metaphysical Poets. Eliot writes, "We can only say that it appears likely that poets in our civilization, as it exists at present, must be difficult. The poet must become more and more comprehensive, more elusive, more indirect, in order to force, to dislocate, if necessary, language into his meaning." So here we get a sense of why Eliot read so much, why Eliot cited so many other poets, why Eliot devised a style of writing which was both creative, also at the same time highly scholarly and encyclopedic. Eliot's explanation in this essay, which by the way is a recommendation not of his own poetry, but that of the metaphysical poets, that is John Donne, George Herbert, Andrew Marvell, etc. So Eliot's point is that because times themselves are so complex, poetry of value must also become complex, erudite, elusive, indirect, so that it can reflect the complexity of the times. Now, this is a kind of contradictory statement. The contradiction in this sentence or in this thought lies in the lack of fit between two ideas. On one hand, the times themselves are not just complex, but there is something about modernity. There is something about the times in which these people found themselves, that is the early 20th century Europe, which was highly undesirable. They were living in times which did not value ideas, intellectual work, spirituality, etc. all of these poets had a very distinct sense that they were living in materialistic times, that concerns of capitalism, the accumulation of property, and then activities necessary for that, activities such as wars, violence, and so on, were given more importance in their times than things like reading, contemplation, culture, philosophy, etc. So there was a distinct sense all of these poets had that modernity was something wrong, something bad, and they had to be critical of it. On the other hand, in a contradiction to this idea, these poets also felt that they must modernize. That is to say, that the poetry of the past was somewhat problematic and could not be simply repeated. So, while the times themselves were modern in a bad way, the writing of poetry and the writing of poetry that these poets themselves practiced, and the kind of poetry that they believed should be read and celebrated, that poetry must become modern in a good way. So there's a contradiction then between a revolutionary aesthetic and a reactionary politics. The politics is reactionary because these poets react to the modern times. They don't agree with the way modernization is taking place around them, and they react to it by saying this is wrong. Their aesthetic is revolutionary because they argue that older forms of writing and thinking are inadequate, and these forms must be updated. So there is a contradiction then between a modernist aesthetic and what the poets feel about modern life. This contradiction remains very strong. It is not resolved easily, if ever, and it continues to be productive for both of these poets. One essay by T.S. Eliot is particularly telling in this context. In 1930, T.S. Eliot wrote an essay on the French poet Charles Baudelaire. Now, Charles Baudelaire has been considered as the inaugurator of modernity, as among the most famous and powerful intellectual figures in modernity. And his most famous essay is The Painter of Modern Life. So, T.S. Eliot also celebrated the power of Charles Baudelaire as an iconic figure of modern literature and culture. In the 1930 essay, however, T.S. Eliot found other things to value in the work of Charles Baudelaire. These values were the essential Christianness of Baudelaire, and these values realized that the real problem of good and evil is what really matters. So sin and redemption became more important for T.S. Eliot. And T.S. Eliot in the 1930 essay found the focus on religion, focus on sin and redemption in Charles Baudelaire more important than the formal innovations. So while earlier Eliot had praised fragmentation, a unique aesthetic in Charles Baudelaire, later he found something else to value. The point is that tradition is never fixed, and that the value of tradition is always adjusted in relation to the needs of the present. A similar thing happens in the 1948 essay that is From Poe to Valerie. Earlier, T.S. Eliot had praised the French symbolists, that is Paul Valéry and Stéphane Mallarmé, as using from the American poet Edgar Allan Poe the idea of the autonomy of poetry, the singularity of aesthetic, and the fact that poetry and art exist in their own universe, uninterrupted, unconcerned by political or social concerns. In this essay, however, T.S. Eliot argues that this concern with aesthetics, the concern with art for art's sake, had been taken to its limit by the French symbolists, and that it was no longer possible to sustain that focus on aesthetics for the sake of aesthetics. That this kind of focus on pure poetry was misplaced and not very productive. So again, the same thing happens. Tradition is something that needs to be made. Tradition does not exist as an inert object which is simply received. The act of receiving tradition is not an act of passive consumption. Rather, tradition is constantly remade, refashioned, based on the needs of the poet's current aesthetic and intellectual projects. This is an idea that distinguishes a lot of Eliot's work, and especially the poetic style that a lot of modernist poets inherited from the Victorian period. The most important poetic style that modernist poets inherited from the Victorian period is that of the dramatic monologue. The dramatic monologue was implemented, popularized, and established by the poet Robert Browning. This is a style that's distinguished by the objective position of the poet, set apart from the speaker who unravels his or her own emotional life to a silent listener. So there are three figures. There is a poet who is creating the poem. There is a speaker, a fictional speaker, who is speaking the words that the poem contains. And then there is a reader who is placed in both ways, in two positions. The reader of a dramatic monologue plays two roles: reading the poem that T.S. Eliot or Robert Browning has composed, but also listening to the words spoken by the fictional narrator or speaker that the poet has created. The reader is therefore drawn to the poem both as an appreciator of an aesthetic object, also in addition as a doctor or an analyst in a psychological case history. The impersonality of the voice is what emerges. It is an impersonal voice because the words on the page are both created by the poet, but also spoken by another person, a fictional character who is inhabiting a particular role. He or she is, and it was most often a he in the Victorian and modernist periods, although there are feminist and female appropriations and adaptations of this style. In Browning and Eliot, the speaker is often a he, and this person often takes a very impersonal approach to his own words. And this impersonality was something that T.S. Eliot implemented both in his poetic as well as critical and prose writings. This impersonality carried a detached scientific observation and the language of precise observation. This was prized by several modernist writers and poets, and we can see how this is a case of very carefully and very sensitively taking from the past. This detached, scientific, psychological, accurate, objective voice was already installed very carefully by this Victorian poet, that is Robert Browning. Some famous poems by Browning, which may be read as a way of understanding this voice, are My Last Duchess and Porphyria's Lover. In addition to poets, philosophers and art critics also exerted a great deal of influence on the poetry and the criticism of modernist writers. The French philosopher Henri Bergson was a huge and powerful influence. Bergson's formulation of experience as a continuous flux very importantly blurred the demarcation between internal and external realms, while his concept of duration unstitched the conventionally separate categories of past, present, and future. T.S. Eliot had attended Bergson's lectures in Paris, and in his thesis in the philosophy department at Harvard, had worked with the philosopher F.H. Bradley, had written about the philosopher F.H. Bradley. Both of these philosophers talked about the autonomy of the individual mind and speculated about the difficulty of separating what is external reality and what is filtered through the consciousness of the individual mind and therefore assumes a different kind of reality. In addition to these philosophers, the art critic Walter Pater also exerted a very huge influence, even though it is not really recognized as such. Walter Pater, the scholar, the poet, and the art critic, had written a historical work, The Renaissance, in the year 1873. This document is key to any discussion of the breaks and continuities across the texts of Victorian and modernist poetics. A lot of ideas of impersonality, a lot of ideas of experience, a lot of ideas of aesthetics are taken from Walter Pater's work and produce a huge and strong influence on the work of T.S. Eliot. Walter Pater writes that the aesthetic critic fulfills his function when he has disengaged a special impression of beauty and noted its virtue as a chemist notes some natural element. And this idea that the ideal critic is one who disengages their personal impressions of a work of art and instead examines the work of art or their own emotions as a scientist examines a work in a laboratory. This idea will be repeated almost verbatim, almost identically in many writings by T.S. Eliot himself, as well as other writers of the modernist period, especially those who call themselves imagists. Another document by Walter Pater that is very important is the conclusion to this Renaissance. In this document, Walter Pater describes experience, describes particular moments of great intensity which are important for anyone to live an aesthetically fulfilling life. Pater writes that the splendor of our experience needs to be reconciled with its awful brevity. The life is short and yet it is very beautiful and intense. The solution to this problem, in Pater's words, is to cram the limited interval between birth and death full of experience. Pater writes, "For our one chance lies in expanding that interval, in getting as many pulsations as possible into the given time." So, pulsations somehow, in Walter Pater's logic, extend the time that we have on Earth. It's an aesthetic idea of time. It is not that the number of years increase, but rather if an experience is aesthetically intense, then it can be felt to increase the time that we have on Earth. And this is, in a nutshell, or in a very nascent form, the idea that later James Joyce would call the epiphany, and also later Ezra Pound would describe the luminous detail. And in some ways, we can find a version of this idea that a pulsation of intense aesthetic value can expand the timeline or the time span that we have on Earth. We can see this idea reflected in Ezra Pound's definition of the image, which I discussed in the previous lecture, and I will repeat that, Pound's definition of the image as an intellectual and emotional complex in an instant of time. So we can see how there are a lot of connections, there are a lot of anticipations, there is a lot of picking up. The modernist writers wanted to call themselves totally new, but they were not totally new. Instead, they drew on a lot of older work, and the newness, if they can be allowed that title, lay not simply in doing new things, but rather in engaging with the past in new ways. That is, repeating old things, but doing so in ways that reinvented the past. And I will briefly reflect on this in the next lecture before moving on to the work of the poet William Butler Yeats. Thank you.